let's start with Asia, although obviously you cover the entire world in your role. But China, of course, presents huge threat and concern, threatening democracy in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan, what it's doing with the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and so on. North Korea remains a serious threat, freedom to its own people and others. The junta in Burma, of course, has been a terrible disappointment. So, how do you see Asia stacking up when it comes to democracy and the challenges to it?
Great question, David. I mean, first, we should remember that most people who live in democracies live in Asia, thanks to the weight of India. That in many ways, China is quite singular in both the scale and scope of its totalitarian, authoritarian surveillance state. Really, it's quite unique in that regard. There are many messy democracies in Asia. You mentioned North Korea and Burma, who obviously fail the test. But I think one thing that's important to note about Asia, David, is that the most successful societies, the most prosperous and peaceful and effective societies in Asia have gotten there by doing democratic opening and reform. You know, Japan's per capita income is 4 times that of China. South Korea and Taiwan's per capita income is 3 times that of China. So when we look at China and its authoritarian development model, I don't see success there. I see it covering up a whole host of problems. And countries like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan once were dictatorships themselves. They only achieved high income, broad based prosperity through building credible democratic institutions. And I still think that's the wave of the future for everyone in Asia, including ultimately even the Chinese.
Do you see the democracies in Asia as models for other countries to follow, or do you actually think that they can play a role not just regionally but also worldwide beyond the Asian continent?
I mean, I'd say worldwide, I think it's really important that, yes, democracy, Western democracy has unique cultural and historical antecedents, but it's really important to remind ourselves that people all over the world have built successful democracies and that the aspiration to freedom, as President George W. Bush has put it, is universal, that there's not something Western about that. And there are lots of living examples of that in Asia. In fact, as Ronald Reagan said in his Westminster address to the British Parliament 40 years ago, it's a form of cultural condescension to say that some people are culturally unsuited to democracy and freedom. That's something the Chinese Communist Party would like you to believe in a very self-interested way, because they want no challenge to their one party, one man rule. But across Asia, we've seen the most successful societies have been those that are pluralistic and have that rotation in power and that political competition.
Thinking a little bit beyond Asia, but thinking about how the democracies that you mentioned can help support others. What can all this family of democracies do to help more nations transition to democracy?
So there are a couple answers, I guess. One is that there are new democratic institutions that are forming, like the quadrilateral partnership between the US, Japan, India, and Australia. There are others kind of germinating, but that, you know, the old UN system in many respects has stopped working when it comes to democracy and human rights. You've just seen an abominable visit by the UN Human Rights Commissioner to Xinjiang in China, where she was totally controlled and almost puppeteered by the Chinese Communist Party. So the UN system really has failed in many respects, and we need to be investing in new institutions that bring democracies together in like-minded groupings, whether small or large. You've seen that obviously through NATO and wider democracy support for Ukraine. You've seen that with the Quad. You've seen it in the things like the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. Democracies need to find new ways to work together to manage 21st century challenges. And that should include, I think very importantly, supporting democratic movements around the world, not for high morality reasons, though those are important, but because we know democratic systems don't produce the massive refugee flows. They don't produce the violent extremists that destabilize their wider regions. They don't invade democratic neighbors, as Russia has just done to Ukraine. So when we think about human development and the potential for all people to reach their potential in the world, investing in democratic institutions is something that we should all be doing, including our friends in Asia, including the US and Europe, but that there's really a pragmatic reason to do this, which is to make the world safer and more prosperous.
You do mention China, and there are those who suggest that perhaps China offers another way, that democracy is not the only way to achieve prosperity. How do you respond to those claims that a more authoritarian capitalist model is something that other nations could pursue as opposed to a democratic system?
So one is that, 99% of autocracies don't end up like China. They end up like Zimbabwe or Venezuela, where their economies literally collapse, standards of living plummet. People, Venezuela was once the richest country in South America. Now 90% of people can't get enough to eat, can't get their medicines. There's so many examples of autocracy failing the most basic development tests. China hasn't actually gotten there yet. Again, countries like South Korea, societies like Taiwan actually were military dictatorships in an earlier incarnation. What happened? They had strong economic growth like China. They built big middle classes like China. And then those middle classes demanded some political rights and some property rights. And I think it's ahistorical for us to expect that that wouldn't happen in China. It was very interesting, Chris, this joint declaration of the Beijing Olympics by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where these two leaders essentially sketched out a world that was safe for authoritarianism, safe for autocracy, safe for their regimes, but unsafe for the democracies and unsafe for the people who live in Russia and China, who of course want accountable and inclusive governance, even if democracy movements in those countries remain very weak. Finally, I would just point to examples like Hong Kong, where you had 2 million people in the streets of China's richest city standing up for basic political rights and freedoms. Of course, they were crushed by the Chinese Communist Party and its security forces. But look at Hong Kong, look at Taiwan. It's ahistorical to argue that Chinese don't want greater rights and dignity, just like people all over the world.
And you got into this a little bit with your answer, but more generally, what conditions do you think are necessary for a transition to occur?
So I do think it helps to have obviously a prosperous middle class. We know that from just looking at the broad spectrum of democratic development over centuries in both the West and in Asia, but it's not necessary. India built a democratic system as one of the poorest countries in the world after it became independent in 1947. Some countries, IRI, we do a lot of work in countries like Gambia, which are very poor, but have very strong democratic movements and cultures. Africa has, an enormous population of some 1 billion young people, all of whom want greater democratic rights and dignity. So I don't think sort of being prosperous is necessarily a precondition. It does help to have international support. Obviously, people around the world want to build their own democracies, but the role of America and American leadership really matters. This is why defeating the Russian invasion of Ukraine is so important. If authoritarian aggression prevails, democracy goes on the defensive all over the world. And it has felt lately that democracy has had to be playing a lot of defense. And so America's moral and material support for people trying to strengthen their own sovereignty and democratic destiny really is important to some of these movements. It doesn't make any of them foreign agents. It doesn't mean that there's some big geopolitical agenda behind this. Again, we just know that countries that have open systems and inclusive political cultures are much better neighbors, better trading partners, and better allies.
We have some challenges here in our own country, and this has given some who don't like what IRI and other organizations like it do the opportunity to throw whataboutism back at us. How do you respond to that?
Just say there's no perfect democracy. We don't support democracy because we think it will produce heaven on earth. We support it because it's better than civil war or mob rule or tyranny, right? And that democracy is not the ultimate objective of human development. The ultimate objective of human development is a sense of autonomy and freedom and dignity and security. And democracy, democratic institutions, and accountable and inclusive and representative governance are just proven to provide that much more systematically than a system that relies on the whims of one man or one party. A great strength of democracy, David, which you've seen in our own country, is that it's self-correcting. When presidents or political parties overreach, there is a self-correction mechanism in the form of elections that put the other party in power and that refresh the leadership. And part of what we've seen in countries like Russia is one man clinging on to power and driving his country kind of into the ground. We've seen it in Venezuela, we've seen it elsewhere in Syria, and democracy essentially has a self-help mechanism that prevents that kind of thing from happening. It also, by the way, if you care about climate change or LGBTQ rights or whatever your agenda is beyond democracy, your voice won't count unless your vote is heard and you can do civic organization and mobilization around your cause. Try organizing around any of the social issues in China or Russia. You get thrown in prison or silenced, or your family gets arrested, right? But only in a free society can we advocate for what matters to us as human beings and bring about effective change. And for all of our warts, American history, I think, is proof that democratic systems are better at doing that than any of the alternatives.
Dan Twining, president of the International Republican Institute, we're grateful for your time joining us today. Thanks so much. A great way to end on that note, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the fine work of the Bush Institute and everything that your teams are doing to advance democracy and freedom around the world. We're very grateful to you. Thank you.